Okay, we are in our final lesson on the book of Colossians. It's hard to believe that we are, but it's only 4 chapters. But nonetheless, I believe, I hope, I pray that it's been a profitable study. What we're going to do this evening is take a look at verses 7 through the end of the chapter, which is verse 18. And this is very typical of the Apostle Paul in his writings. He generally closes his writings out with greetings from whoever might be with him in ministry at that location. Or at times, like in the book of Romans, chapter 16, he acknowledges so many people who had played a role in his ministry. And so Paul is a man who has been given a important task to do, as he asked for prayer that he continue to be able to speak boldly. And he took that seriously, and just as seriously, he thanked people who worked with him in spreading the gospel or doing errands for him. Now, the reason that this is taking place is that because Paul is in prison. And sometimes Paul would send Timothy back to Ephesus, and that was because Paul was moving on to a different location. And so we have a list of people here beginning in verse 7. And what I want to do is take a look at them, how Paul describes them, and then come up with some summary statements. All right, Paul acknowledging his co-workers. First of all, Tychicus. Verse 7, as to my affairs, Tychicus, our beloved brother and faithful servant and fellow bondservant in the Lord, will bring you information. So Tychicus has a specific task that the Apostle Paul wants him to do, and that is to report back to these Colossae Christians, and probably the Christians at Laodicea as well, and let them know what is going on in Paul's life, what his challenges are, how the gospel is spreading. And so Tychicus has a very important job to do. Notice that Paul describes him as a beloved brother. This is a term of endearment between two Christian brothers. He is also described as a faithful servant. So whatever the Apostle Paul gave Tychicus to do, he was faithful in accomplishing the task, whether it was easy or not, whether it required a lot of time or not, whether it required distance and traveling. It didn't matter. He was a faithful servant. He could be counted on to do what he accepted to do. And he is also called a he is also called a fellow bond servant in the Lord. Now, we talked about this concept of bond servant last week. And this is one who has been redeemed, has earned his freedom, but decides to stay underneath the master because of love and loyalty. And so, what a wonderful description of Tychicus. When life got hard, he was faithful. When life became difficult, he remained as a bondservant in the Lord. And notice in verse 7, he will bring you information about Paul's condition and what was taking place. And then you have Onesimus. We'll finish up on verse 8 with Tychicus. For I have sent him to you for this very purpose, that you that you may know about our circumstances, and that he may encourage your hearts. So he has a twofold purpose in traveling back to Colossae. Here's what's going on in the Apostle Paul's life. And through that information, they would be encouraged about the perseverance of the Apostle Paul and the power of the gospel. Now, along with Tychicus, verse 9, and with him Onesimus, our faithful and beloved brother, who is one of your number, they will inform you about the whole situation. Now, we know Onesimus. We know Onesimus in a relationship with Philemon. Paul wrote a letter to Philemon about Onesimus. Onesimus had evidently stolen something from Philemon and then drifted down into Rome, where he could easily be absorbed and unnoticed. But somewhere along the line, he came in contact with a Christian who introduced him to the Apostle Paul, and Paul led him to the Lord. And Paul taught him about reconciliation, and he wrote a letter to Philemon about reconciliation, namely, receive Onesimus back, not only as a slave, but also as a brother. Treat him as you would treat me. So there is a richness about Onesimus. And just stop and think about his willingness to return to his master, Philemon, unsure of what the impending result could be because he was a runaway slave. Now, notice he is called, as with Tychicus, faithful and beloved brother. Faithful and beloved brother. In such a short time, he demonstrated these qualities. And so, as Tychicus and Onesimus traveled together, and upon their arrival, they informed the Colossae church about Paul's situation. And then you have Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, sends you his greetings. Now, we don't know anything particular about him. He is mentioned in one or two other closing epistles of Paul. And it simply says he is my fellow prisoner. So evidently he is incarcerated with the Apostle Paul. And Paul is incarcerated, if you go back up to verse 3, because of the gospel and him preaching the truth. So evidently Aristarchus was a part of the preaching group of men and was arrested at the same time that the Apostle Paul was. And instead of focusing in on his own hardship, he sends greetings to this church. Then you have John Mark. Notice how it's phrased there, sends you his greetings, referring to Aristarchus, and also Barnabas's cousin, Mark, and we know that is John Mark, about whom you received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. Now, Paul had given John Mark a black eye. He had branded him, if you please. Remember, on the first missionary journey, Barnabas wanted to take John Mark with him. And Paul did not have any objections to that. But about a quarter of the way through, there was persecution, physical persecution, that Paul and Barnabas experienced. And John Mark was not prepared for that, for such a reception. And so he deserted Paul and went back home. Now, you remember in the second missionary journey, Barnabas wanted to recoup John Mark, and Paul says, no way. And he specifically said he cannot go because he deserted us. So Paul has labeled him, and Barnabas stays behind. Remember, there was a disagreement that was so sharp and severe that Barnabas and Paul parted company. Barnabas took John Mark and stayed in the hometown, and Paul took Silas and started out on the second missionary journey. But somewhere along the line, Paul's mind was changed. I don't know whether he heard reports from other of his friends about the change in John Mark, but here he says that John Mark sends his greetings, and he was going to send him, and he warns this church that if he sends John Mark to you, you receive him. Don't shun him, receive him as a brother in the Lord. We also know from 2 Timothy that Paul writes that John Mark was profitable in the ministry. So Paul had some changing to do. He was a perfectionist. People needed to behave and act like he did and endure what he did and how he did it. Paul forgot that God made each person individually. And so Paul spiritually grew up, and we see that maturity. And then we have Justin, verse 11, also Jesus, who is called Justice. And Paul wraps up here in verse 11, these are the only workers for the kingdom of God who are from the circumcision, and they have proved to be an encouragement to me. Circumcision, okay? That means that they had gone through the physical rite of passage, and despite the squabble back after the first missionary journey, whether Christians needed to be circumcised or not to be Christians, these 5 or 6 men, faithful in serving Paul and administering the gospel. And this is all we know about him. He is a fellow worker. We don't know exactly what his assignment is. We don't have much other information than what is listed here, but Paul appreciated what Justin was doing. Then Epaphras in verse 12. Epaphras, who is one of your number, a bondslave of Jesus Christ, sends you his greetings, also laboring earnestly for you in his prayers, that you may stand perfect and fully assured in all the will of God. Now, Paul calls him a bondslave, and we've already explained what that was. But I want you to notice some things that Paul adds. First of all, Epaphras sends his greetings. And Epaphras has a specific ministry where he labors earnestly for the Colossae Christians in prayer. So he is a mighty prayer warrior. And the purpose of his praying in verse 12 is that they may stand perfect, or they may stand mature and complete, and being fully assured in all the will of God. So Epaphras has a very powerful ministry, and coupled with Paul's intensity of prayer that you read almost always in any of his epistles near the beginning, they must have made a mighty, powerful team of encouragement to one another, and also for the people that they were praying. For I testify for him, Paul says, that he has a deep concern for you and for those who are in Laodicea and Hierapolis. So Epaphras is burdened for these Christians in Laodicea and Hierapolis. God has laid this burden on his heart, and he has embraced it and is faithful to intercession for them. And then we have Luke, the beloved physician. Now, Luke gets picked up in the second missionary journey and is with Paul his entire life until Paul is martyred. He is a historian because he wrote the book of Luke and he wrote the book of Acts. But he is also a physician, and if you read carefully both Luke and or Acts, he will use medical terms in describing the work and the ministry of Jesus Christ. So he was Paul's personal assistant in the physical area. Now, Paul had evidently, from what scholars say, an eye problem, because in verse 18 he says, I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. And in another epistle he says, see what large letters I use. So he had some type of eye infirmity, and many believe that this was the thorn in the flesh that Paul prayed to be relieved of. So Dr. Luke, a dear, dear companion, not only spiritually, but physically as well. And then you have Demas. Demas sends his greetings according to verse 14, but you need to understand that Demas deserted Paul for the pleasures of the world. This is found in 2 Timothy. So Demas, like Judas, had a hidden agenda. And when it was not forthcoming, he decided to cash in what he could and recuperate his losses. Then in verse 15 it says, greet the brethren who are at Laodicea and also Nympha and the church that is in your house. So there's a church at Laodicea. Many believe it was the Colossae church. Verse 16, when this letter is read among you, have it also read in the church of the Laodiceans, and you, for your part, read my letter that is coming from Laodicea. So it was very common for Paul's letters to be circulated around the Bible-believing churches. Now, in verse 17, you have one final person, Archippus. And Paul encourages him, saying, take heed to the ministry which you have received in the Lord, that you may fulfill it. Well, we see this name in the book of Philemon, where evidently he is an elder or a spiritual leader in the church at Philemon's house, the house church. And so Paul is encouraging him in his ministry and reminding him that he has received it from the Lord and that there is an end result that he needs to fulfill. And then Paul closes out saying, with this greeting with my own hand, remember my imprisonment. And Paul closes out the letter. Now, if you take a look at your list there, you have one person that Paul was actively involved in his salvation. That's Onesimus. You have one person that was restored in Paul's mind. That was John Mark. You have Demas, who deserted Paul because of going after worldly pleasures. And so Paul poured his life into people, and he worked with them. And for the most part, if you compare this list with Romans 16, he had quite a vast discipleship mentoring ministry besides all of his writing, besides all of his teaching, besides all of his preaching. And so this concludes the book of Colossians. All right, any thoughts or questions that you might have?